Good morning. Welcome back to the Big Share Live and the first panel for this morning. Before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Angela Davis with Madison Community Foundation, and we are just beyond thrilled to be one of the maybe inaugural sponsors of Community Shares. And it is my honor to moderate this panel today. And a little bit about me quickly. Like I said, I'm Angela Davis, and I serve as Director of Grant Making at the Communities Foundation. So we will get started today, this morning, with Defending Drinking Water. Community Share member coalitions take on PFAS. So we have an amazing panel this morning, and I will be asking questions of each of our panelists, and they can introduce themselves as we go through the questions. And our first question is for Amy Barrio. So Amy, is Wisconsin's drinking water safe? Tell us about the threats of PFAS contamination.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much. I'm Amy Barrio, Communications Director at Clean Wisconsin. And I think there's a lot that we need to kind of step back and learn about PFAS and how it touches our lives beyond just drinking water. Drinking water being safe is kind of almost a personal decision when you consider the number of contaminants out there and when you consider what PFAS are. So first I want to explain kind of what are PFAS. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances is what that stands for, and it's really a class of chemicals, thousands of different types of chemicals that were first produced in the 1940s. And we don't really know exactly how many kinds of PFAS are out there because chemical companies don't have to disclose when they produce a new one. In fact, they're proprietary in some cases. So we don't know exactly how many, but probably between 4,000 and 6,000 different types of these compounds. And there are a few things that make them really concerning. The first is how fantastic they are. PFAS are great. They put out jet fuel fires. They can make your jacket breathable yet water resistant. They can make your pots and pans nonstick. The dental floss you use glide through your teeth more easily. Food containers not leak grease or water. So they do all of these really useful things. And it is no exaggeration to say that we are surrounded by PFAS chemicals all the time, every day, in our shoes, our backpacks, our couches, our carpets, our cookware, all kinds of things. That's the first concerning thing about PFAS chemicals. The second is you've probably heard that they're called forever chemicals, and that's because they are so persistent. They stick around in the environment. We don't see them naturally breaking down in the environment the way other chemicals do. So what that means is, for all intents and purposes, as far as we can tell, most of those chemicals that were produced for the last 80 years are still with us almost exactly as they were when they were first created. And they only have a few places to go when, firefighting foam washes into the storm sewer or your jacket starts to decompose. And that is to our water, our soil, our sediment in our lakes and rivers, plants, fish, animals, people. And for some of the newer types that are smaller, they can be in the air. So that's the second concerning thing about PFAS chemicals. And when we talk about cleaning up PFAS or filtering or remediating, we're really just moving them to another location. So for example, in Wisconsin, when we collected firefighting foam that contains PFAS, those containers went to a landfill vault in Alabama until we can figure out how to destroy them in a non-energy intensive process. And so it's a little bit like nuclear waste in that way. And the last concerning thing about PFAS is there appear to be health impacts at extremely low levels of PFAS. And I'm not talking about all the thousands of kinds, because there have not been meaningful health studies on all the thousands of kinds that are out there. There couldn't be, even if we knew what they all were. But there have been health studies on some of the older types Some of the ones that have been phased out in use but are still with us, of course, because they last forever for all intents and purposes. And those health studies point to concerning higher risk of health impacts at part per trillion levels. So when we're talking about EPA regulations in drinking water in the single-digit parts per trillion, that's exceptional. When you think about a chemical like arsenic, it's regulated at the parts per billion level. So this is a magnitude lower than that in drinking water. Again, for just a handful of those thousands of types of chemicals. So when you take a step back and you look at the PFAS problem kind of as a whole, we're not exactly talking about legacy contamination. We're talking about products that we use every day. We're talking about being surrounded by PFAS chemicals every day. And the way we regulate chemicals in drinking water in this country, there has to be sort of a meaningful health study on every single one of the chemicals that gets regulated. So we are never truly going to know, I think, the impacts of all of these chemicals that we're exposed to every single day. But what we do know about some of these types of PFAS is that they are very concerning. And we think that most people carry these chemicals in our bodies all the time, every day. So that's PFAS in a nutshell. In terms of water being safe to drink, I think, water is essential. Mm-hmm. And I think for most people who get water from a municipal drinking water system that is tested for this handful of types of chemicals, you can have some reliance about what your exposure is and that it is minimized. But for a lot of people in Wisconsin, they don't have that. They're exposed to levels far higher than the single-digit parts per trillion level. And I think we're going to talk about some of those folks today. But the PFAS issue in general is far greater than drinking water even.
Wow. Thank you, Amy, for really breaking that down for us. Wow, almost speechless at this point, learning so much just from our first question. Wow. Peter Burris, next question is for you. If PFAS is being found all over the state, what are state legislators doing to deal with PFAS? Now, am I saying it right? PFAS?
Yeah.
PFAS, okay. Have this little twang going here. Is there anything that can be done on a statewide level to address this problem? And this is a critical issue, as you all know, and as Amy explained to us. So we really need to know what can be done on a statewide level.
So the short answer is yes.
Okay.
There's a lot that can be done on the statewide level. And first of all, thank you, Angela, for moderating, and thank you to Community Shares for bringing us together. My name is Peter Burris. I work as the Government Affairs Manager with Wisconsin Conservation Voices. And I guess, to start, I'll say that if you have been seeing the headlines about PFAS, there's a good chance you're probably pretty discouraged. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about gridlock and disagreement. Will funding get out the door for communities? Won't it? And I think a lot of that frustration is very justified because our legislature moves at a glacial pace, does not currently represent the will of the people. And we have a lot of work to do to fully get our arms around this issue. But if you take a big step back and you look at where we are right now when it comes to PFAS remediation, compared to where we were 3 years ago, I think there's a lot of reasons to feel really hopeful. And a lot of that is rooted in the progress that we've been able to make together. I think about the work that our organizations do together with impacted community members across the state and the progress that we've been able to make. And that's particularly related to, I think, 3 key areas of state action. So when we think about state action at Wisconsin Conservation Voices, we think about first, standards, second, funding, and third, prevention. So first, on the standards front, we need health-based standards. And 3 years ago, we didn't have any standards. We still don't have health-based standards, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Because of the work of organizing across the state, we advocated for local leaders to be brave and voluntarily test their water, even though there were no standards in place. And a spattering of brave community leaders across the state tested their water, released their results, and that was enough to start driving attention to this issue. Because unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, we started to find contamination in more and more spaces. And that led to the state's first ever drinking water standards and the state's first ever surface water standards. And that led to comprehensive testing, which fueled the second kind of space where we are right now, which is on funding. 3 years ago, no funding for PFAS remediation in Wisconsin. The bipartisan infrastructure law is bringing about $50 million into the state for PFAS remediation. And last summer, the legislature and the governor all together agreed on $125 million for PFAS remediation. And I think the organizing on that front is also really exciting. A little under a year ago, we were here in Madison for Conservation Lobby Day. We had about 50 organizations, 50 pro-conservation organizations, endorsing a pro-conservation agenda that included, as our top ask, substantive funding for PFAS. And so, that in combination with years of advocacy led to this first good down payment on funding PFAS remediation. So really excited about that. And third, on the prevention front, 3 years ago, not talking too much about what phasing out these chemicals would look like. We had some conversation on the table about phasing out in paper products, but just last week, Democrats introduced legislation that would ban the use of non-essential PFAS in our consumer products beginning in 2028. And this is legislation, a ban and a phase out that largely mirrors what's happening in Minnesota. And so it's what we need to do to get these chemicals from getting into our environment in the first place. But that's not to say that we don't have a lot of work to do. Certainly a lot needs to happen and our legislature needs to move more quickly. So on the standards front, we need groundwater standards for PFAS. A third of Wisconsinites rely on private drinking water, private wells for their drinking water, and they currently do not have any protections against PFAS contamination. And that's largely because of a unconstitutionally gerrymandered legislature that has really followed the will of stakeholders like Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce rather than the will of the people. And so I'm optimistic that that will change, but that's where we are right now. We need to get a groundwater standard in place. We don't currently have one. On funding, the $125 million is still sitting in an account because the legislature cannot come to an agreement on how that funding should go out the door. And Republicans have first asked to implement new restrictions on how we can hold polluters accountable before that funding goes out the door, and that is not okay. We should all be able to agree that we just need to get this money to communities. So we're really encouraged by Governor Evers' compromise proposal, which says we're going to stand up community grant programs that are very similar to what Republicans have proposed, but without any poison pill attached. So we're supportive of that, encouraging others to support it as well. And I'm hopeful that that funding will go out the door in the next few months here. And third, on the prevention front, we just need to get this legislation across the finish line. We need to support any effort that prevents these chemicals from getting into our environment in the first place. But I am very optimistic that, again, with new maps on the horizon and continuing to work in partnership with great organizations like MEA, River Alliance, and Clean Wisconsin, that we can do it.
Thank you very much. I heard a couple snaps there, or saw a couple snaps. That's real, Peter. Advocacy is huge and critical, and being so close to having those funds available, I can't imagine how frustrating that can be as well. Thank you. Tony Wilkin Gabbard. Your organization represents the public's interest in environmental protections in the courts. Are there any avenues to protect drinking water through litigation? And I know that you all have done a lot of work in this area. So share a little bit with us, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Community Shares for putting this panel together. It's a pleasure to be up here with our close partners. So Your question about what roles the courts can play with this problem is a really good one, and I want to build off of what Amy and Peter have just said. Amy talked about the fact that the process of setting health-based standards requires lots of evidence. It's a time-intensive process. Peter talked about the fact that we don't have a groundwater standard in Wisconsin yet, and that we're still in the process of setting health-based standards. And when we're in that kind of situation, that's typically called dealing with an emerging contaminant. And PFAS is an emerging contaminant. It's something that's in the environment. It's something that's harmful to human health. And it's something for which we don't have health-based standards yet. And in that situation, the courts can play a very important role because individual lawsuits are really the only one of the only sources of accountability that we have for polluters. And we've seen that in Wisconsin and across the country over the last several years. We've seen impacted communities in Marinette, on French Island near La Crosse, in Wausau, across Wisconsin, across the country, sue PFAS polluters. And the judgments and the awards, the settlements from those lawsuits can be part of the way that we get resources to treat drinking water and hold polluters accountable. The problem with those kinds of lawsuits, though, are that they can be a little bit like whack-a-mole. They're time-intensive. They involve, just a group of polluters for individual situations. And that's why it's so important that we develop those health-based standards for PFAS, because those are standards that will protect everyone prospectively. And that's why our organizations are working so hard to make that happen here in Wisconsin. So litigation can be a powerful interim strategy while we're dealing with contaminants for which there aren't health-based standards. Another powerful legal tool that we have in Wisconsin that is critical is the spills law. And this is a bedrock environmental and public health law that's been on the books for over 45 years in Wisconsin. And it stands for the very simple and common sense notion that you can't release something that is hazardous into the environment, and that if you do, you have to clean it up. It's common sense. It's part of our environmental legacy in Wisconsin that we have this powerful law on the books. And because it doesn't require that there be health-based standards set ahead of time for the spills law to apply to a substance that's hazardous, it's really the only legal tool that we have to hold polluters accountable in Wisconsin. It's the bedrock law that is requiring cleanup in Marinette and Peshtigo, where Tyco Johnson Controls has caused an enormous PFAS plume as a result of the manufacturing and testing they've done with firefighting foam there for many years. So that's the good news. The challenge, though, is that the spills law is under attack in a lawsuit that was initiated by Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, our state's largest and most powerful business lobbying group. Peter alluded to the sway that WMC can have in the legislature, or that it has lately. They're also flexing their muscle in the courts. And they initiated several years ago a lawsuit to undermine the state's ability to use the spills law to address PFAS pollution. So my group, Midwest Environmental Advocates, along with River Alliance, we are in court with 4 other parties defending the spills law. And in fact, tomorrow we're expecting a decision from the Wisconsin Court of Appeals in that case. We're hopeful that the spills law will be vindicated. If the decision goes against us, though, you can be assured that we will work on an appeal to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, because so much is at stake in that lawsuit. So big share today, and then a big decision tomorrow for many of our groups.
Okay. And I love that you all work together and being collaborative. That is the mantra of Community Shares, and what you all are doing as part of Community Shares, that really makes a difference. And what I've learned also, Tony, common sense is not always that common.
That's
you
right.
know?
We need to defend it, for
We
sure.
do need to defend common sense, that's for sure. Allison Warner, what is the role of grassroots community organizing in protecting water? Tell us about how people who are concerned about their drinking water are taking action in Wisconsin.
Well, thank you for that question, and good morning, everybody. I'm Allison Werner, Executive Director of River Alliance of Wisconsin. River Alliance has been around for a little over 30 years now, and we've been working to empower people to protect and restore our waters all that time. So you said collaboration and local voices is essential to all of our work, right? You've heard it over and over again today about all of us working together. And I think the PFAS efforts around the state are a shining example of what listening to local voices and working collaboratively looks like. The folks on this panel, along with my colleague Bill Davis, and many folks, many water advocates from across the state have been working collaboratively, for well over a year to learn about the legislation, to analyze it, to work collectively with all of our strengths, to really look at the legislation critically, to think about what needs to be improved. And Peter talked a lot about that we get these proposals, but we really need to step back and look at how will this impact all the local folks across the state, their drinking water, their wells. How do we make sure we have the strongest legislation possible to protect the health of all the folks across Wisconsin? When Amy spoke, you heard about how complex this issue is. There's no single solution. You also heard from Peter and Tony about all the communities across the state that are dealing with this issue. PFAS is a statewide problem. It's in small towns, it's in big cities. It's an issue all across the state, which means we really need to take our time to listen to local voices, to hear from them about what they need to make sure their health is protected and that they have clean water to drink and recreate in. Amy talked about this is in our fish as well. So when we talk about communities where there's a strong need to have fish as your food source, we also need to take a look at that issue as well. So there are so many amazing water advocates across the state in the communities Tony mentioned and more that have been advocating locally and at the state level for the legislation, the policies we need to, again, protect our health and water. So I want to share a couple of those examples of these amazing water advocates. A couple formed a group called Save Our Water in Northeast Wisconsin, and it's around that Tyco issue that Tony brought up. There's folks like Cindy Boyle and Doug Oitzinger who've been advocating for years to get better policies to address this issue of PFAS and also get clean water for their communities. Cindy is in the town of Peshtigo, and when she and other local folks learned about this issue, started looking at how do they get improvements for their drinking water wells, they weren't seeing enough action in their community. So they did a very smart thing. They ran for office, and they got elected on clean water issues. Doug was a former mayor in the city of Marinette, now on the city council, and again was advocating locally for protection around PFAS. But he's one of the folks Tony mentioned that joined that spills lawsuit amicus brief along with several organizations, because he wanted to make sure companies like Tyco are held accountable for the environmental damage they're making. Tony also mentioned French Island, amazing advocate over there, Lee Donahue, who is a town supervisor in the town of Campbell. You've heard a thread here, right? People saying, hey, one way to get involved is to step up and run for office, which is a great way to make sure your voice is actually at the table. But there are other ways too. Lee and her community were also working on making sure water quality testing happened, that studies were happening to really take a comprehensive look at PFAS challenges in their community. And one of the long-term solutions they're looking at is to have a public water utility. Because right now, most of their community is getting bottled water provided to them by the Department of Natural Resources. Drinking bottled water every day, using bottled water in your day-to-day life is obviously not a long-term solution. So these local folks are studying, they're analyzing, they're looking at what are the long-term solutions we need. In addition to legislation, they're also looking at things like this public water utility idea. Folks like Lee and Doug and Cindy have also been advocating for what Peter talked about, the release of the $125 million that's been sitting in the legislature's trust fund since July 1st of last year, still sitting there. And folks like Lee, Cindy, and Doug, and many other water advocates have been talking to their elected officials, have been talking to reporters to make sure everyone's understanding the importance, the urgency of this issue being addressed. So it's these amazing water champions out there in the grassroots level that are making the difference. The last thing I want to mention is, Tony mentioned PFAS is an emerging contaminant. We've obviously, unfortunately, had other contaminants in our water in the past. And unfortunately, there will be more. And as an organization that's been around 30 years and working with our partners across the state, we know not only is this a statewide issue of the need for clean drinking water, it's a nonpartisan issue. And our elected officials know this too, but we wanted more evidence for that. So a couple years ago, we did a non-binding advisory referendum in 2021 and 2022, and 10 counties around the state started this effort. And the question was around, should we have the right to clean water? Seems like a no-brainer question, right? But we wanted some evidence to prove this is what people want all across the state, no matter your political affiliation. The 10 communities that put this question on their ballot, we had no lower than 73% yes vote and all the way up to 86% yes vote. And we went to purplish counties, I'll call them. We were in Marquette and Outagamie and all sorts of other communities across the state. So we're trying to show this is a nonpartisan issue. Unfortunately, last year, the legislature took away the ability to have these advisory referendum on questions like this. I don't know what they might be afraid of people saying what they care about. So now we've switched gears and communities are doing resolutions at the county board level instead to continue to show that this is that clean water is an important issue. Ashland, Monroe, and very importantly, Marinette County is the most recent county to pass a resolution to ask for the state to establish the right to clean water. So these water advocates across the state at the grassroots level are doing amazing work, and that's what it's going to take to keep pushing our legislature to do the right thing to provide clean water for everyone.
Wow. Thank you very much. Allison, you all are so powerful and have such an important message that we all need to take to heart. And now we'll have a round robin wrap-up question, and I will start with Amy, again from Clean Wisconsin, the communications director at Clean Wisconsin. So where do you see Wisconsin's drinking water in the next 10 years? What's your vision? If you had that crystal ball, what do you see?
Well, I think, you know, I had the part of this panel to kind of lay out the problem and how big it is just for one contaminant, PFAS, or one type of contaminant. And that can really feel overwhelming. Mm-hmm. It's like, what do we do about this huge issue that feels like it has no end in sight? And then you get to hear from all of these great people and great organizations that are you know, taking each piece of it and saying, okay, where can we start? What can we do? And so it's so wonderful to be a part of this partnership and to, you know, work with communities and work in the legislature such as it is, but, you know, to kind of see the momentum and to understand that with any kind of problem, you just have to start. You have to get in there and start doing the work. And with drinking water especially, it's so personal to people. Mm-hmm. People want to be able to trust that their water is safe. And when they find out, if they're up in Marinette or Peshtigo or any of the other communities, that it's not safe, it's heartbreaking. And you know, we really need to be there for those communities and work with those communities and start attacking those problems right where they're happening, and that is what is going on right now. So that gives me a lot of hope just on the PFAS issue. And then generally, you know, Clean Wisconsin and our partners work a lot with other contamination issues, like agricultural chemicals, nitrates, things like that getting in the water. And what we're seeing is farmers wanting to be part of the solution, wanting to say, okay, you know, this is our water too, how do we protect that? And we are seeing movement in the legislature on some of those kind of agricultural issues, grazing bills, things that can help minimize contaminants running into our waterways in Wisconsin. So that brings me hope to know that really people want to be part of this solution and to know how deeply everybody cares about drinking water. You know, it is not a partisan issue, as we were talking about. So it's it's hard to talk about a huge problem and then say, but wait, there's hope. But there is hope. And it takes all of us, every single person up here in our organizations, in communities, to constantly stay vigilant and to push forward. But that's what gives me so much hope, that we are seeing people doing that.
Thank you very much, Amy. And now our Government Affairs Manager, Peter from Wisconsin Conservation Voices. What do you see in your crystal ball? In
Well,
10 years.
Yeah, in 10 years. Well, I think the good news is that there are exciting things happening right now. We've talked a lot about the challenges associated with the legislature, but lots of great resources coming into the state from the bipartisan infrastructure law and President Biden's Affordable Clean Energy Plan that are really going to make a difference on safe drinking water broadly. But in terms of the legislature, I'm excited about fair maps. So under 12 years of an unconstitutional gerrymandered legislature, again, we have seen that it is the will of Wisconsin manufacturers and commerce is the law of the land. And that has created kind of a dystopian nightmare in many cases, not just on safe drinking water, but a lot of popular issues that Wisconsin voters care about. And I think what's most horrifying is that communities have really been pitted against each other. Somebody's success in one space means somebody else doesn't get resources. When we're sitting on a historic surplus, and everybody should get safe drinking water. That should be pretty basic. We shouldn't be pitting communities against each other on water-related issues or any other human rights issue. So under Fair Maps, I am really excited to live in a space where the will of the people can become the law of the land, because we are living with competitive districts where our candidates and elected officials need to be responsive to what people want. And as Allison was saying, action on water is popular. We know that everybody wants to be seen as good on safe drinking water. And so I'm incredibly optimistic about our ability to make progress in a representative democracy starting in 2025. And I think also leading up to that, I'm really optimistic about the organizing opportunities that brings us. We have a really, really cool opportunity and responsibility together as organizations in partnership with other environmental organizations, public health-based organizations, and people across Wisconsin to build the broadest and boldest safe drinking water coalition that we've seen, that cuts across not only PFAS, but lead and nitrate, other safe drinking water issues as well. So I am just really excited to do that work and see how that work pays off in a space where we have fair maps.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now, our Executive Director of Midwest Environmental Advocates, Tony, what do you see in 10 years in Wisconsin in regards to drinking water?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to pick up where Peter left off, and he talked about the fact that we've had to deal with an unconstitutional gerrymander for the previous 10 plus years. So if we think about where we're going to go in the next decade, I think it's helpful to take a look back prior to the unconstitutional gerrymander and what we saw in Wisconsin and what we expected from our leaders in Wisconsin. And in the decades prior, Wisconsin was a leader in the protection of clean water. We had some of the most innovative and forward-looking water protection laws in the country. Staff people at the Wisconsin DNR helped EPA write the regulations for the Clean Water Act in the 1970s. I mentioned the spills law, which is an innovative and really powerful tool that we've had to protect water in Wisconsin. We have a comprehensive groundwater law, whereas that doesn't exist in many other states. And so if we think about the decade ahead of us, I think we can return to some of those values. One thing that we've talked about at MEA over the last several years is that this whole issue that we've been talking about related to PFAS really has been, in a lot of ways, a stress test for environmental democracy in Wisconsin, because we face this incredibly pernicious environmental issue. Everywhere chemicals, forever chemicals that are harmful in incredibly small quantities, a very, very difficult environmental challenge. And the question has been, with the problems with democracy in Wisconsin and with attacks on state agencies that are supposed to help, like the DNR, were we going to come out the other side? Was our state going to be able to respond? And we're still in the thick of it, for sure, but I think with the fair maps and some of the progress that we've talked about today, we are coming out the other side, and that the decade ahead of us is a really promising one where we can return to the values that have really always guided us in Wisconsin. And in that respect, I'm really hopeful about the next generation that will protect water in our state. At MEA, one of the things that we get to do is help train the next generation of Wisconsin's environmental lawyers through our clerkship program, and their energy and their passion is something that inspires me and gives me confidence for the next decade. So while we've talked about some really difficult and thorny issues, definitely a lot of hope moving forward.
Thank you very much, Tony. That next generation, people better watch out. They
Yep,
are
absolutely.
They are no
Powerful.
joke, and they're ready. They're powerful. They're going to be really powerful. Okay, River Alliance of Wisconsin Executive Director Allison, what do you see in regards to drinking water in Wisconsin in 10 years?
Well, instead of just saying ditto to everything you
Right,
said, right?
right.
All sorts of amazing and important points that were made, and I love the hope and optimism. It is, for all of us, as we said, for how many years we've been on defense for a long, long time, right? And this opportunity that the fair maps are bringing us and all the grassroots work happening across the state to be positive, to be proactive, to be out there championing what we think actually might happen legislatively. So I want to bring up one thing Peter mentioned earlier that we think is really important, specifically to PFAS, and that's the prevention side. It's banning PFAS. It's following Minnesota's footsteps, like Peter said. We are so far behind in Wisconsin of getting to that point. We need to have a precautionary principle that says we're just going to stop putting out chemicals that we know may cause harm, right? We need to have more prevention. So the legislation that was proposed recently that would get us on that path to banning PFAS, we think is really important. But the other piece is looking comprehensively. We've been spending the last couple of years, actually, at River Alliance, looking at a long-term vision of what we were hopeful when we get to this place where we're going to be next year, right? I'm going to keep putting that hope, where we're going to be next year, where we can not only propose positive legislation, but it will pass. And we want to be prepared. So we've been looking at how do we look at our water challenges at a watershed scale? How do we have communities work beyond county and city lines? How do we get back to looking at things holistically and comprehensively? So we've been working with folks at the local level on just that, not only for water in general, of how we plan for the future. Climate change and is putting a lot of stressors on our waters. So how can we work on a larger regional scale to address all of our water challenges? But also, Amy mentioned agriculture. That's the other piece we've been working on for many years. Pollution runoff from agricultural lands is one of our biggest contaminants in our water across the state. There are farmers trying to do the right thing, and so we are about to launch an agricultural agenda for Wisconsin that, again, is looking big picture, long term. How do we address the barriers in the systems to getting at clean water? And that's what gives us hope, is not only what we might be able to do legislatively, but how we can work together as a state and a community to look at the system level changes that need to happen to get us clean water.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. I know we're coming close to the end, and we'll take questions if we have any, but a question while you all in the audience are formulating your question. I've heard a couple of times about our neighbors in Minnesota. What are some of the things that they're doing that we'd like to replicate, in your opinion? Or at least consider replicating? Any of our panelists can take that question.
Well, I just briefly, they have made efforts to get rid of PFAS in fast food containers, and that's a big deal because we talk about water, and we're here talking about water today, but people are also exposed through the food that they eat. So that's just one of the, I think it's a suite of legislation that was passed in Minnesota to start dealing with some of the other exposure routes of PFAS. know if anybody else has.
I would just add that my understanding, limited understanding of Minnesota, is that they have a much more long-term sustainable
Okay.
funding system for their safe drinking water projects. And I think that's something that I would love to see in Wisconsin, rather than every 2 years fighting for, we need this much money these 2 years. What's the long-term strategy on funding to make sure that we're keeping up with our infrastructure projects and ensuring that folks' water is safe to drink?
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
So one question I had is, you've mentioned like fire foams and manufacturing, that kind of thing as sources of PFAS. I was wondering, in rural areas, what you think the primary sources of PFAS into the soil and groundwater might be.
I have somewhat of an answer to that.
Can you repeat?
Oh, sure. So the question was, we talked about some sources of PFAS contaminations in water, and in rural areas, what do we think the sources are? Really, there's the issue in Marinette and Peshtigo, which is the sources of manufacture of firefighting foam. And then we look in other parts of Wisconsin, and we're looking at airports. So for a long time, airports were required to train with firefighting foam to put out jet fuel fires. And there were no precautionary measures that they had to follow. So whether it's the Dane County Regional Airport or the airport over in La Crosse, you're seeing contamination plumes coming from those airport areas or military base areas in some communities, because so much training happened with these firefighting foams, and then they were just, the foam was just left to run off. Because what we tend to do in this country and everywhere is produce chemicals and put them out in the environment in large quantities without ever trying to figure out whether there are any harms associated with those chemicals. And so we're talking the 1940s until really recently, there was no thought about using and training with firefighting foam and then just letting it kind of go off into the environment. So that is one of the bigger issues in communities. Airports tend to be outside of towns, outside of cities, and communities are, French Island, for example, is near the airport, getting water that has been contaminated over many decades with firefighting foam. I don't know if y'all have others.
I'll just add, as you've heard about, PFAS are in our waste streams, and that they've been used in the manufacture of a lot of products like fast food packaging and papers. In Wisconsin, we have a large paper industry, and so the industrial waste streams from those facilities get treated. And because we don't have health-based standards, there haven't been limitations on how many, or the amount and the quantity of PFAS that are in those waste streams. Well, for many years, the biosolids from those waste streams have been spread on agricultural fields because they're rich in nutrients. And so that's another way that PFAS have been dispersed through the environment, and especially in rural areas on farm fields. And so that's one of the leading theories as to why town of Stella, which is like 10 miles east of Rhinelander, many people would say, oh, this is in the middle of nowhere, you don't see any factories or airports around, how PFAS likely contaminated the groundwater there.
Wow. I know you mentioned as well, thank you for the question. Amy, you mentioned the firefighting foam was being shipped out of state.
Yes.
We don't have any place to put it, or are other states doing that as well?
I could say there's a whole lot of issues that brings up. So Alabama, as far as I'm aware, has a large landfill, but like a fancy landfill.
Okay.
That takes PFAS contaminated substances. And so that is where, when we collected firefighting foam here in Wisconsin that contained PFAS, that's where the company that collected it ultimately brought it. I don't know how many facilities there are like that.
Right.
And I don't know how close that one is to filling up, but I think, just from kind of moving our contamination to another place, brings up a whole host of environmental justice issues and
Right.
how we deal with our contamination as a society and who has to live around that. And it does share some parallels with something like nuclear waste, where, yes, there are ways to break down those very persistent PFAS compounds, but those ways right now are very energy intensive. And at the scale that we produce PFAS, breaking them down, especially when you consider climate change and not wanting to use a lot of energy for things, starts to become a big issue and a big puzzle. So again, when we talk about cleaning up PFAS, it really is just moving it around to another spot.
Wow. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for putting this on. I think when people, think of PFAS, it's a very kind of overwhelming idea or topic. So I guess in your opinions, where are the most direct or effective places to direct education or advocacy as an individual or as a small community?
And can you repeat the
great
question?
So looking for how can communities and individuals get involved, take action on such an overwhelming issue, right? Which, unfortunately, a lot of us talk about, climate. Many of our environmental issues are, right, they feel overwhelming. Climate change, things like PFAS. When you hear they're everywhere, now what do we do, right? And I think one of the important things that came up earlier is, for communities, is testing. If your community, wherever, whether you're on a municipal system or, an individual drinking water well, are you testing? Because information, knowledge is power, right? We all know that, right? So a place like Madison here, the municipal water systems are required to test, and that's happening now. And we found out here in Madison, we do have a well with PFAS, and that's being addressed. That happened in Wausau. If I'm correct, every single well, well for the city of Wausau had PFAS contamination, big problem addressed. But without testing, we don't know the level of problem each community's needing to address. So wherever folks live, people will be hearing this all over the state, hopefully, especially if you have a private drinking water well, it's your well just for your house, test it, find out what's happening. Because as was mentioned, someone living in the town of Stella of 600 people, you would have assumed we're fine here. But without testing, we don't know. So testing your own water, advocating for your community to test, that's one way I would suggest of taking a first step, is just the information, getting the knowledge of what is the state of the quality of your own water. Yeah.
And if I could add one, just in terms of something you can do right now once this panel is done, would encourage you to call your state representative and your state senator and ask them to support the governor's compromise proposal for getting the PFAS funding out the door. Joint Finance needs to release those funds today, and so definitely encourage you to make that ask of your elected officials.
Thank you. Final call for questions? Sure.
So you've collected the data from your well. What do you do with that data now? Who do you recommend sharing that with, or kind of how do you crowdsource that knowledge?
So the question is, once you know what's going on with your water quality, right, who do you tell, right? And I'm going to look this way a little bit, but locally, your either city or county health department would be a great place to start. Communities around the state, some of those local health departments are actually the ones leading the charge to encourage water quality testing or actually conducting the testing. So getting to your local health department is a great first step of who to communicate with. Additional ideas down there? Yeah.
If you're on a private well and you find contamination, there's still money available from the program that Governor Evers set up through funding through the American Rescue Plan Act. That's a limited bucket of money, but there's still some available. So if you find contamination and need help, definitely recommend going to the DNR's website and looking at that program and applying for some funding.
And something that doesn't always get talked about when we talk about testing yourself, be careful what clothes you're wearing. When we're talking about single-digit parts per trillion, that doesn't take a lot for a jacket, or if you've been eating fast food or something like that, to contaminate a sample. So you have to be really careful when you pull that sample. And testing your own water isn't easy. That's a reason why municipalities have whole testing departments. So it's really hard to put that onus on folks, but that's where we are right now in Wisconsin as we try to learn more.
Thank you. One last question? Okay. Thank you so much to our stellar panelists. Thank you very much.